Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St.Gallen podcast by Julian Kölbel. Welcome to the next episode of my podcast, Innovations in Sustainable Finance. I'm Julian Kölbel, assistant professor at the University of St.Gallen. My guest today is Dr. Christine Chow, and we plan to talk about the art of active ownership. How does it work and how to do it well? Christine, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
The pleasure is absolutely mine, Julian. It's so nice to reconnect. I remember we first met in Zurich more than 10 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. What a long time it has been. So it's great to have you here. You are currently the head of active ownership at Credit Suisse Asset Management. And can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of, your experience in this area of active ownership? How did you get there?
Sure. I joined the fund management industry in the late 90s. And, when we were at university, we learned about the principal agent problem between investor and company. And joining the fund management industry as my first job, I promptly realized that actually the investment value chain is very long. So I was wondering how the investment expectations, not only financial return, but the philosophy and ethical principles of the asset owners, such as the pensioners, the savers, how are they being reflected through the products that are offered by fund managers? And how do they communicate?
Perhaps to start with, let's fix some terms. So there are several ways of describing this communication process between investors and companies, right? It could be shareholder engagement, active ownership, stewardship. There are all these different words. I'd like to ask you, how do you refer to it and what's the essence of that?
For me, more broadly, active ownership or investor stewardship is the meaning of being a carer. You care about what you invest in and how that capital is deployed, no matter what your position is. So I think the narrower definition of stewardship or active ownership back 20 years ago would be about, we need to vote. We need to have dialogue. We need to make sure that the board is independent. The documentation or the papers that come out through the years, as early as the Cadbury Review. If you remember the earlier papers that come out, they're all very governance related because of governance failures in the 90s that led to sort of the foundation of this industry. But over time, stewardship, if you look at Stewardship Asia in Singapore, their definition of stewardship has different aspects. You have the corporate leadership type of stewardship. There's also the investor stewardship. So we're seeing more and more terms that describe this proactive element of being an investor. And it's not just about being a shareholder and vote. If you talk to experts in the PRI community, this is a term again, the Principles for Responsible Investment community, the expectation is that there needs to be a stewardship or active ownership strategy for different asset classes. And that's also, what my belief as well, that active ownership shouldn't be just about engaging with companies on board issues or dividend or audit quality and accounts and the different, what we call ESG label issues, which is a term that I'm not so keen on anymore because it is just too vague. It should be about understanding what are the systemic issues that are affecting us as a society. Where are the levers and who are the stakeholders that we need to talk to drive that change?
If I understand correctly, it's a lot about having a meaningful dialogue. And I see that both as having strengths and weaknesses. The strength being that this is very flexible, right? You can really, dig into complex issues. You can create understanding. You can, capture complicated strategic topics and really sort of, have a dialogue between investor and management. The weakness perhaps is that this is a little bit informal. It's behind closed doors. So from the outside, there's sometimes the suspicion that people might just meet and talk, and then both parties walk away and say, it's good that we talked, but nothing really has happened. And I also believe there are huge differences in the quality of active ownership that's being pursued by different institutions. So what would you say are the hallmarks of good engagement?
Good question. Let me go back a little bit on how we categorize an engagement. Right? An engagement should be a purposeful dialogue in which the investor has a theory of change in the way that there would be a specific ask of a company to perform a particular change, and that the investor can justify why that change is relevant and material to the company and the investment itself. So starting from that basis, I think we need to, as an industry, get better at defining what engagement is, because having that one line is not enough. So as you can see in the latest active ownership report of Credit Suisse Asset Management, we have categorized engagement interactions into 3 types. So there is a flow chart. The first one is, did you have a meeting? Why did we meet and talk?
Okay.
So that is one. And then later on, in addition to the meeting, have we got a specific ask that we want to change? And then we categorize it as an investor dialogue. Do we set specific targets and expectations in that particular change? Do we measure it? Do we track it? And then only by passing and acknowledging that those are the characteristics of engagement, we call it a structured engagement. So what does a good engagement looks like? I think that engagement is a two-way process. So if the target is for companies to come around to the idea that certain change proposed by the investor is a good idea, it's a good for the company to perform, to carry out, then a good engagement would be the company itself acknowledging that the investor actually took part in driving that change, and they are acknowledging their input into that.
Yeah, it's nice to have these acknowledgements. I completely agree and see why. I'm curious, you said it was a two-way process. You also mentioned that the investor has to have a pretty clear idea of what is the ask. At the beginning, at the initiation of such an episode, is there also the case that investors still need to learn a little bit what might be relevant for the company, right? There seems to be a process of where it's still fairly open in the beginning, at least I would imagine, or do you always come in with a set ask and otherwise you wouldn't even initiate the meeting?
As I mentioned, you come in with a hypothesis of what might need to change.
Okay.
But hypothesis doesn't mean that you go in with like 500 different KPIs and say, please give me all this information. If not, it's not. That, I think, is putting a lot of pressure on the company without first listening. So we should go in with a hypothesis, for example, talking to a company. If say, it's a company that is hoping to establish insetting carbon credits. So having offsets in the value chain, such as nature-based solution, so that they have better understanding of the offset process that is of higher quality, but also support the businesses or possibly the farmers in the supply chain in the low-income countries, then that is a hypothesis that they should be focusing on. But it wouldn't be up to the investors to say, this is how you should do it, because we will never have the same level of technical knowledge and company-specific knowledge of that process. But the hypothesis itself it's sound because this is aligned with the future business model of a particular company, if this is what they want to pursue. So I think the role of the investor is that, can we confirm this is where you want to go, and this is how the company is going to contribute to fighting climate change and achieving net zero? And if you are, can you tell us what is possible? So, for example, in the recent conversation, we're talking about helping farmers to deploy technology that can help them track certain KPI. The investor's role is to say, well, we know these are the challenges because we have come across them in other parts of the world that we had a conversation. And how are you going to overcome these challenges? So our investors' role is to prompt based on our broader knowledge of different types of companies and their different operating model and business model, and prompt those questions so that the company is like, oh, I haven't thought about that. Let me dig a little bit deeper into it. And that's also the learning process as well. But we should always, as investors, humbly listen to the company on the journey that they're on, and to prompt the right questions.
So you're saying you have to listen, but also bring something complementary to the table. And that's, of course, not easy because the companies are presumably quite expert at what it is, the particular thing that they are doing. What would be perhaps examples of complementary insights or inputs that you can bring as an investor?
Sure. And I think this touches the investigative engagement element that we talked about as well. Of course, a company would have a much better understanding of their businesses than the investor. But the investors also has the ability to talk to other companies. So when I mentioned the spirit of investigative engagement is for investors to understand who are the anchors in the global supply chain in order to get a better understanding of a sector approach to certain issues. So, for example, we have engaged with a big OEM, original equipment manufacturer, in the apparel supply chain, to understand not only whether the apparel industry has a supplier code of conduct or not. And by engaging with the anchor players in the global supply chain, we're able to understand how well the apparel top companies, we call them topcos, are implementing their supplier code of conduct. Who is better at doing sort of on-site visits and prompting the factory managers with better questions or tougher questions? So these are the insights that we can get as investors. There's also EV materials supply chain. I mean, the global supply chain, there are different types of supply chain in different sectors, and we will be able to get that insights by talking to companies that are sitting in the chain, but maybe not as apparent as we see in the portfolios. Another way to do it, of course, is to do on-site visits. I used to do quite a lot of factory visits that help us to understand the culture of companies. Because we talked a lot about the importance of culture. Regulators have also have papers to talk about the importance of culture of a company. However, for a global company, you don't just have one culture, you have subculture. And if there are processing plants and factories, the local culture is very much managed by the facility manager as well. So on-site visit is also important. And sometimes we get better insights than just talking to the board members on the top executives through that type of visits.
Interesting. This idea of not only talking to one company, but to several and cross-validate what you hear and what they see. I can see how you, in that case, may complement the picture that the company itself may have. What sort of homework do you need to do as an investor before approaching the company? I can see companies, rolling their eyes when they have to meet with potentially a big investor. How do you frustrate them in the first meeting, and how do you, what do you need to do to start off on a good foot in this conversation?
Well, first of all, I don't try to frustrate company.
Sure, but maybe you know how to do it from your experience, or you have seen things.
Well, I think everybody can do it. We're not here to break the company apart. In fact, we're quite the opposite. So let's go in at the meeting with an open mind. And we've actually established the do's and don'ts, suggestions of do's and don'ts for our engagement. So in terms of recommendation, our team would recommend and start off with an overview of what we like about the company. I mean, who doesn't want to hear what investors like about what they do?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, yeah.
Yeah. So we start off with, I have read your reports. I have read your annual reports. I've read your sustainability report. And these are the 5 things that we like, whether it is a internal carbon price or something around how a company has taken a much more holistic approach in understanding sustainability, you name it. And also highlight in which page of the report that we find those information. I find this very useful in getting a positive start to a conversation, because there are a few messages here. First, we're telling the company that actually all the efforts and money and time and the pain of putting all these reports together, we read them because we care. That's a very important point. And secondly, it helps us to set the tone and the agenda of the theory of change. Because if they are so good already, why do they still need to change? Oh, well, that is because we think that you're already doing some of the work, but you're not really bringing out the essence of that proposition. Let's talk about what we can do better, because you already have it. It's just not optimized. And that kind of conversation will energize the company to say, yeah, it's there already. Why don't we do that a little bit more? Just build on it. So yeah, and the don'ts would be to start off with something that is probably related to a controversy from 15 years ago and say, what are you doing to do about it? Well, they already know about it, obviously, and maybe the company has been approached by many investors on the same point. So, and I've seen that happening in some group meeting, for example, when we talk about all controversy, they just completely turn off. But what I'm saying here is not that we don't talk about it, is that we talk about it at the right time and asking the right questions. So if it's something to do with a past controversy, what do we actually want to ask as an investor? Well, we want to know if it is related to a litigation. Is that happening in multiple jurisdictions? If so, what would be the financial impact, right? Do we know that it is going to be a case that is going to be involving a jury? Because that might change the outcome depending on the composition of the jury. And then what has the company done to get a better assurance of the financial impact of those litigation? Have they engaged an external legal expert? Who is it? What is the process they've gone through to understand? So those are the clarification to understand controversies-based related issue, rather than say, oh, well, this happened 15 years ago or 10 years ago. What are you going to do about it? And I think that that actually gives us much more concrete understanding of the company in their learning. And of course, then besides the ex-post handling of controversies, there's also the ex-ante element of what is the company doing in order to strengthen their position in preventing future issues.
Yes, I think that would be my main question personally. Is it going to happen again? And what are you doing about that? I can really see how it's also a professional validation. I imagine in those meetings, there will usually be chief sustainability officer or people from that department. And from my experience, it's very valuable for them to have an external validation from an investor saying, yes, you've done a good job here, because who else is going to tell them that? I think there's a big element in engagement with, I think, is underemphasized sometimes. On the one hand, you might think, well, you want to have a turnaround story of, doing a company something completely different from what they've been doing before. But I think there's an important reinforcement element of that, which you've, I think, just described.
But we have also approached company with a completely new topic. For example, is responsible AI, right? I started that topic, I think, 2018. At the time, most people were still thinking that, well, AI is not an ESG topic, and so I'm not sure why you're working on it. And I remember at the time I said that it will be, and it has. Well, certainly this year, there's a lot of discussion around generative AI, but rule-based AI has been around for a long time. And I remember taking that paper that I co-authored with a lawyer, a technology lawyer, who was also looking at the AI regulations at the time. We talked to companies and Some of them say, we're not a tech company. We don't have to worry about it. And of course, that has changed now because every single sector, industry are looking at how technology, possibly generated AI, but also there are other types as well, can help its business model. Some companies are really open to it. For example, when we engage and said that, well, you need to start off with understanding where the value add could be and the principles and the specific use cases. And those that are more forward-looking and bringing their head of data science and AI to the meeting. They said that it's the first time that they meet with an investor because no investor has asked to meet with them before. And they said, that's great. That means that we're working on something that is forward-looking. And we've seen some good results.
Yeah, I was about to ask. So do you think you did succeed in convincing a few companies to think about these issues earlier or better than they otherwise would have? Because I agree, now everybody is woken up to the topic.
I do not want to claim the credit. The credit is only possible given by the company. But I would say that the questions from investors have resonance within the company. So there are voices already in the company saying, well, this is important. I don't know how to communicate it with senior management, with the board. And then the investor voice came in and said, look, I think we need to look into this. And they were like, yes, thank you very much. So have we succeeded? I think if there's any success, it would have to be a partnership. It's a partnership between those who have the forward-looking mindset within companies, and they are the ones whom I call champions in companies, and investor having the foresight and the conviction to say that we're not bound by the existing ESG basket of topics. We're looking beyond. We're looking at the holistic business model and looking at what matters.
One reason why I'm quite interested in active ownership is that of the mechanisms of sustainable investing, this is one that is reasonably well supported by academic evidence for its effectiveness. So there's a couple of studies that reasonably strongly suggest that shareholder engagement on environmental or social topics actually is followed by improvements among the companies who have been engaged. One side result is that it works more effectively for companies that already have a good performance on these dimensions. So it's more a reinforcement mechanism, perhaps. But I'm also always very curious whether there is something to this turnaround story. So is it feasible to initiate engagement with a company that really is abysmal in, on these areas, has never thought about it, doesn't think it's relevant, ignores it? And can you have a conversation in such a case? And what happens? Have you seen that?
In order to have a turnaround, having only the investor voice is not sufficient. It's one of the conditions you need in order to capture the turnaround value. What else is needed, but from what I've seen from experience, is usually something that's blown up. Maybe there was a big accident, such as Rana Plaza.
That was a textile factory collapsing, wasn't it?
So like an industry-wide type of incident that wakes up a lot of laggards, and then it trickles down to the whole supply chain, right?
That's an interesting story. Okay, and yeah, tell me more.
It can happen at the company level, which that would be probably a change in management and mindset of waking up to this, like, oh my God, I think we need to do something, but we don't know what to do. And that is the point where an investor with the conviction and the foresight to go in and say, look, let's work on it together. Maybe we need some expertise in a particular area, maybe we need to change your workflow, maybe strengthen your documentation and governance and oversight, but also training, etc. So you need some kind of incident to trigger that aha moment, and then investor can come in to say, look, let's work on it. Let's do a work plan together. So Rana Plaza is one that it's not specific, or it can be specific to a company, but the impact is so huge that it actually changes the standards and expectations of the whole industry, and it trickles down, through the supply chain and those who are quick to react and to make improvements actually grew the business in the supply chain, because there are only so many manufacturing suppliers that would meet the highest standards of the top codes, right?
Yeah, I think that relates to what you were saying earlier of driving change across a broader set of companies and really being a bit of a connector through the supply chain, understanding the needs of the companies with the big brands and the producers and the intermediaries.
That's a part of what good engagement is to go beyond understanding the silos of single companies.
Yes, and recognizing these opportunities when it's worthwhile approaching, and what's the right time to say what. So pretty much as in any conversation, I guess, but with higher stakes. Something I wanted to ask as well is the reputation of active ownership with end investors. I hear mixed things. Some people are really convinced that this is the right thing to go. They don't want to be bystanders, right? They want to get involved in the companies they're invested in. They would love to see this change. But it's very hard to demonstrate to your end clients what is really happening, right? Because as you say, what's easy to observe are the votes. If you vote at the AGM for or against a proposal, that is very easy to show, and some funds, are observed on that metric, and people say, hey, you didn't vote for all the ESG proposals. Whereas if you're a bit deeper in the subject matter, you know that not all of these proposals are perhaps useful or meaningful. So maybe you shouldn't vote for all of them. Plus, the vote is usually not binding. And finally, most of the action happens before the vote, right? The successful funds, as I'm told, they get their demands met before they need to move to a vote. But this clever way of doing it is very hard to show to your customers. And that's why I feel that there is less active ownership than there should be, perhaps, because it is hard to show what you're doing. And because there are questions around how well is it done from the outside.
It depends on what you mean by showing. I can assure you that in any firm, the internal auditor would be making sure that the records are complete. I guess when it comes to end investors, there are different types of end investors. Obviously, if it's an institutional mandate, when they do their due diligence and questionnaire, there is a private, through those questionnaire will be able to, or a fund manager would be able to provide more specific evidence of their engagement. But in general, I think that asset managers need to up the game in improving the quality of documentation, whether it is through a structured sort of CRM system, so database where you can search, you can categorize information, to the setting of milestones. How do we track progress? And this is also in the UK Stewardship Code as well, that engagement should have clear objectives, and then we're able to articulate and track the progress as well. So having those systems and workflows in place and to strengthen it over time, I think is a good start of making it more visible to the end investors through the right channels.
I suppose I'm always in favor of transparency and including that sort of transparency. I certainly would love to look at these records as a researcher, but I have my doubts that the normal client would, have enough time to appreciate that level of detail. What I'm concerned about very concretely is that a fund that has an excellent engagement team may not get labeled as a sustainability fund because of the holdings. They don't look very green, even though there's a lot of engagement happening in the shadows. So very concretely, as an end investor, if I have two funds to choose from, how do I differentiate the quality of engagement services that is offered to me as an investor? What would I look for to discriminate?
More fund managers are now publishing more case studies, whether it is in their active ownership report or as standalone cases, to demonstrate and document how an engagement is initiated, the feedback of the company, the progress, and then the end result. And ultimately, again, I I would like to seek the company's endorsement at the end of that write-up. And I think those would be the examples that an investor should look at, because they're concrete. It's not just a number. Because don't forget, well, you and I both understand that any number can be manipulated, whether it is a score or, anything, because it is contextual. Whereas if you have a case study that highlight, on this date, this is what we do. This is the action that's been taken on the investor side, and this is a recommendation, and these are the actions that companies have taken. These are more factual. And I hope that this type of factual disclosure would give end investors confidence that the fund have, or the asset manager have a good documentation system that highlights the activities that have taken place that ultimately lead to that change, above and beyond any scores.
Yes. Yeah, I think I would like a credible, well described case study. I would love to combine it perhaps with some numbers, and I completely agree they can be manipulated. And what I would love to have in addition, and I don't know if that exists, is I suppose you could certify such a process. There are professional certifications for all kinds of things. Why not for active ownership, right? There would be a number of things that I can think of off the top of my head, like capacity. You have to have the right staff. Do you have this tracking system? Does it fulfill certain minimum specifications that you would want to have? I think that would offer investors a shortcut to, at least, because I am concerned about funds that simply say they're doing engagement and they're actually not doing anything. I think that's presently, and I'm not saying that many funds do this, but presently this is a concern you might have as a client, because you just don't know. And if you see one case study, you still don't really know. Is there a sort of certification system, or do you think that would even be feasible?
I personally have been exposed to third-party assurance assessment.
All right.
I think that does exist. I think it's a good idea to have that. And I'm sure that consulting colleagues and friends who are listening to this is music to their ears. I personally am open to that idea. I think that's good to have that type of assurance process.
Great. And let's hope someone is listening and will have that in in the future. I would certainly love to look at it. On your manipulation, that's actually something we're working on. So there is a concern that relates to the academic evidence we have so far about engagement. Is it may be that engaging funds not actually change the company. They are just good at identifying the companies that are already changing, right? And that would be an easy way to manipulate sort of successful outcomes. You would have a bunch of successful outcomes if you just quickly make companies a target when they know they're pretty close to achieving the goal. Yeah, do you agree that there's at least a risk that these numbers, if you were to sort of put any regulatory emphasis on them, would be manipulated in such a way?
Is it a manipulation, or is it just spotting a low-hanging fruit? Right, so it's not really a manipulation, and that's why I think in good engagement records there needs to be documentation that highlights what is the contribution of the investor, and also going back a little bit is, what is the investment thesis related to this particular change? So, for example, with the documentation that I look at when there was an engagement that is being scheduled in the record, there should be, what are we expecting from this engagement? Is it an engagement that we know that if there are certain issues that have been addressed, maybe a board or succession issue that is being addressed at a company, then it would make it more investable? That should be in the record. So what is the investment thesis of this particular engagement if it does work out? And also at the same time, what would be the consequence of this engagement if it doesn't work out? And I'm not saying it is just a matter of, invest or divest. And I think this is also the problem of this industry. It's to have that binary understanding of it's either yes or no. It doesn't work like that. Because in portfolio management, you have many different options. You can limit the exposure. You can reduce the exposure. And then maybe in certain products, it needs to be relevant to a particular benchmark. And also in fixed income, for example, you can change your exposure in the new issuance. Do you want to have that new issuance? And what is the offering of particular bond? So there are actually many, many different ways of translating that engagement outcomes into investment action that is beyond that binary understanding of invest or divest. So I think that is an area that should be further explored if there is any interest from a research perspective that will give more clarity on how investment decisions are made in general.
Yes,
as well.
I think you touch upon a very important point. First of all, I agree. The arsenal of sanctions and rewards that you have as an investment fund is much more fine-grained than just buy and sell. And at the same time, I'm curious, it's my suspicion, that it's very important that the portfolio manager sort of has your back, in the sense that you're not just talking for the sake of talking or ESG performance, but there is a fund behind you that, depending on what's the outcome of the engagement process, it will be taken into account. Not necessarily that they will right away sell if it's not successful, but at least that the company believes that there is some investment relevance to all that exchange of information. What's your take?
It's not the right way to invest in resources either. That active ownership activities and outcome would have to be integrated to the investment decision-making process. Otherwise, it's just activities on the side, right? And we don't want that. We want activities and resources invested to be accountable to the end investors.
Don't you think, in the same way that engagement needs investing to be really effective and successful, ESG investing needs engagement dialogue so that companies will know what portfolio managers are actually looking for?
Well, that is just the responsibility of the investor to communicate what they find as a good approach of a company, and communicate that and voice their concern. That is just, I would say that's just should be a normal practice.
But I'm not sure it is.
Well, if it isn't yet. Maybe we started with this podcast,
right?
But the art of engagement, which is the topic of the title of this podcast, is the art of engagement. Is how you communicate that in a way that is palatable, in a way that the company doesn't feel that you're asking them to do something that is beyond their limit. And I remember in the earlier days in certain emerging markets, there were engagement conversation around how come you haven't committed to net zero? Some companies just say, we can't. We don't have access to, we don't even know where to find renewable energy sources. And just looking through what's possible in our scope 1 and scope 2, and you ask me to do scope 3, they're just not there yet. We cannot, in order for engagement to be successful, we cannot ask a company to do what is beyond their capability. You have to help them to think about how to develop that capability so that they feel that they're on the trajectory in the right direction. Then you can ask. And you asked me about bringing in my experience with writing here in this podcast before.
Yes.
I completely different topic. But for me, real parallel thinking and learning is to be able to bring what we know in one area that seems completely different to what we do professionally, and still apply that. And I learned this from training horses and riding. No matter how talented a horse is, you have to prepare them in order to execute certain movements beautifully. You can't just say, oh, let's do this. We're going to turn right. We're going to turn left. We're going to do, dancing. You simply can't do it because the horse is not ready. Or maybe I'm not ready, right? An entity is not ready. You cannot ask an entity, an organization, an animal a person to do something they're not ready for. But what we can do is to help them understand that maybe this is a good idea to do this, and what can we do to prepare for it? And once they are prepared, it would be executed beautifully. And a good engagement professional should be sitting here and say, oh, this is what should happen anyway. And it just did. It just did.
I love that analogy. So it's almost a great point to finish the podcast. But I usually ask my guests, looking into the future, what they wish would happen in sort of the space that they see. So I'd like to pose the question to you as well.
I hope that asset managers in general will become better at articulating what high quality engagement and the outcomes would look like. And that I think over the years, we've been chasing numbers, whether it's, let's have higher score because it's supposed to signify that things are getting better. And I think with your research, we understand that there are different rating methodologies, and therefore there are the different messages that might come through higher score. So pushing for higher numbers of engagement. We did 10,000 engagement this year, 20,000 next year. We should recognize that there is a risk in pushing higher numbers. So it is the responsibility of asset owners and asset managers to articulate what high quality engagement should look like, what outcomes we should be looking for, and how it is integrated with investment decision making so that we can have a true or new phase of sustainability or mainstreaming that have active ownership at the essence of what good investment should look like.
Wonderful. So lots of work ahead still, but thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners also had valuable insights into what the art of active ownership is all about. Thank you so much, Christine, for being here.
Thank you for having me, Julian.
Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Julian Kölbel.